Okay, gewaltig. State Mishnah, Elul Dvarim, the following are a list of items, she'ein chayavin aleya mishum pigel. You won't be chayiv for pigel on them, meaning that if you ate them on a korban that was pigel, that you wouldn't be chayiv for eating them. They're not part of what becomes usher because of pigel. As Rashi says, Elul Dvarim, she'ein chayavin aleyam kares b'achilasa. Mishum pigel. If they were pigel and you ate them, you wouldn't be chayiv koresh for it. And we're going to see why. Number one is hakaimetz. The kaimetz is the matir. It's the little bit of the mixture of the mincha that's placed on the mizbeach, v'ketayres v'halavayna. And let's just see Rashi, Amud Aleph over here. I'm sorry, Amud Beis over here. Hakaimetz im kamatz lechal shirayim lemachar. Somebody made kmitza, and he had kavanah that the shirayim will be eaten lemachar. That's a classic case of chutz l'zmanoi. V'nispag lo hamincha, and now the mincha is possible to pigel and also to eat with a chi of kares. The shirayim is also to eat with the chi of kares. Eino oichel is a kaimetz b'kares. If someone eats the kaimetz, that would not make him chai of kares. She'ena pigel chal elo al dover sheyesh lo matir ma'acher. Pigel, what becomes also machamas pigel? The hutar, the item that became mutter due to something else being matirit. But the thing that was the matir itself, that does not get the isra of pigel. Via koimates, einacher matiroi. Nothing is matir the koimates. Fakert, the koimates is matir the shirayim. Kihu matir samincha. And the same thing would apply to lavoina, the chen kulam, ktaris as well. It's what your makrib, there's no shirayim. And therefore, there's no isser of pigel on those items. Zok the Mishnah weiter on today's daf of Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. Uminchas kaihanim, the mincha of kaihanim, uminchas koin mishiach, which Rashi says minchas kaihanim means really the minchas nidvas kaihanim. If a koin gave as in the dova carbon mincha, kula kola, the whole mincha is brought on the mizbeach. There's no kmitzadah, so there's no davar hamatir, nor is there a davar hanitach. The whole thing is put onto the mizbeach. The same thing with the minchas kohen Mashiach, which Rashi says is the minchas chavitin that the kohen gadol brought every day. Half was brought in the morning and half was brought in the afternoon. The adam, and the dam we know is the matir. V'nisachim, and the nisachim that accompany a carbon. I take it back. V'nisachim aboin b'fnei atzmon, nisachim that come on their own. Rashi says very importantly, bein shis nadam b'fnei atzmon. Sai if they're on their own because someone was menadav just nisachim. Kidamar b'menachas misnadav of minchas nisachim, or bein shebo b'glal zabach. We know most carbonates have when chasam and skem kimudavar. Shlosha asonim laporish, nasonim la'ayel. We saw in lakevis v'yan kiniske, we saw lachaper, shnesirin klachasa. So the nesachim are always something that have to accompany a carbon, even if they came machmas the carbon, which means the carbon are matir the nesachim. Elo shehevi hayoim zivchoy unesachav lemachar. But the nesachim were not brought the same day as the carbon. And that's allowed. The Amar min chosam and eskem is even af l'machar. Those are also not called hutar machmas the carbon, and therefore there is no din pigel on them diver of meir. Aval mavinim zivchoy. But if the nesachim were brought together with the carbon, u pigel bezevach, and there was a pigel in the carbon, nispaglu on nesachim. In those cases, the nesachim would be also machmas pigel. So nesachim zokar meir, it depends on the scenario here. If they're standalone nesachim, or nesachim that were done on the next day or at a later time in the carbon that it was connected to, those, do we say, do not have a din of pigel. But if they're nesachim that are brought accompanying a carbon, those will have a din of pigel. Even those are not going to be pigel. Why? Zokt Rashi. Since you have the option of doing the nesachim the next day, not on the same day as the carbon, even though you did bring them together with the carbon, we don't consider them connected to the carbon. Therefore, nimsa sheina zevach matiran likarev, elahein matir nesatzma. They're matir themselves. They don't have an external item that's matir them. Therefore, there's no din pigel on them. Okay. What about loig shemen shal mitzayir, which Rashi tells us that they spritzed it on the mitzayir itself, but shiyorev nechol, the leftovers were eaten. So there is shirayim. Like shemen shal mitzayir is a machlokes. Rab Shimon Omer ain't chayavin alav mishum pigel. Rab Meir Omer chayavin alav mishum pigel. Why? Shedam ha'osham matiroi. Rab Meir holds that the dam of the carbon osham that's brought together with this oil is matir the oil, and therefore l'chol sheyesh loy matirin bein la'odam bein lemizbeach. Anything where there's a matter, whether it's matter to be eaten or enjoyed by a person, or whether it's matter the imurim to be placed on the mizbeach, all types of things that have a matirin are chayovin alav mishum pigel. Let's see Rashi. Ein chayovin alav mishum pigel, which is the loig shemen shal mitzayir according to Reb Shimon. In pigel be'asham loy nifkal haloig. If there was a machshavas pigel during the akrabas ha'asham, the loig shemen that accompanies it will not become pigel. Dr. Rashi, Yaf al pisha loig toli be'asham. Here the loig does depend on the asham. K'dichsiv al mekaim dama asham. The pasuk connects them. V'mloi nasan midama asham tchila ein nesinas Hashem and klum. The avodah done with the shemen is nothing. It's invalid if it wasn't first utar by the dama asham. So oibazoi, it should be a classic case of pigel. Dr. Rashi afilu ochi. Even the adam maybe ashamay achshav the loig ad asara yamim, from the time when someone brings the asham, you can actually wait up to 10 days before you bring the oil. Nimsa sheina asham matirai. By definition, they can't be linked. They can't be considered a dover amuter by the asham, since you could wait so long to do it. Even the eno matirin, it falls into our rule. Ein chayav and Allah mishum pigel. That was the cheat of Reb Shimon. But Reb Meir Omer, like about asham, boy bayoim chayav and Allah mishum pigel ba'asham. So Reb Meir always has that caveat. It's possible that it's a dover that doesn't have material. It's a dover shebefnei. But if it was brought together with the asham, then we will still consider it something that became mutter due to the zrikas dam of the asham, and therefore we will say that it's tameh. I'm sorry. We will say that it could become pigel. Okay, gewaltig. Zog to Gemara. V'chol sheyesh le matirin. Anything that has matirin, bein la'adam, bein le'mizbeach, chayavin alav b'shul pigel. Ha'oila, the carbon oila, no one could ever eat it. Is that something that's becoming mutter? Dr. Yes. Dr. Mishnah, yes. Dama matir es besora lemizbeach. The dam is matir, it's basar lemizbeach. Dr. Rashi dichsiv v'zar kradam v'hadu v'archu. Only afterwards are you going to set up the imurim on the mizbeach, and the oira lakayadim, and the hide at that point of the animal of the carbon oil would go to the kayadim. Oila sa'oif. What about another sa'oif? Again, dama mater es pesar le mizbeach. This rikas adam is mater that now you can put and pour it on the mizbeach. Chata sa'oif. Dama mater es pesar le kayadim. Chata sa'oif. Its dam is mater the basar to kayadim. Rashi speaks out. How do you know? Where do we know from that by a chata sa'oif the basar goes to the kayadim? Zokt Rashi, the Gemara is going to tell that to us tomorrow. Parim on the Srafim, Usairim on the Srafim. So those are Parim that their meat does not go on the Mizbech. Emurin go on the Mizbech, but their meat are just burnt out of the Azor. So they're still something that's subject to pigul, because damon mater es emurein likare. Since they have a muram that become hutar, machmas desrikas adam, they're also under the rule of pigul. However, Reb Shimon Aimer, that the param on the srofim, the sirah on the srofim, those are not subject to the din of pigul at all. You know why? Because kol she'enu alam mizbech achitzon kishlomim ein chayav in alav mishum pigul. Where do we learn the whole parsha of pigul from? From Shlomim. The entire parsha of pigul was said by the korban Shlomim. So therefore, we say that the only type of korbanos that will be subject to the Isser pigul will be korbanos that have a similarity to the Shlomim, meaning its meat is going to be placed on the mizbech achitza. But if not, if its meat is placed michutz la'azara, like it is by the param Srofim, they are not subject at all to the Isser pigul. They are not in the parsha of the Isser pigul. As Rashi says, shepigul ksiv behu ein kishlomim she'ein matan dami al mizbech achitza kishlomim shepigul ksiv behu. The whole parsha of pigul is by the korban Shlomim. Ein chayav nelav mishum pigul. They will not be ended pigul. So the general rule that we've learned from our Mishnah today is that if it's not a davar hanitar, if this thing that you want to eat from a behemoth that had become pigul is not a davar hanitar, rather to davar hamatir, there's no chiyuv kares to eat it. Now, where there's a discrepancy between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon or Reb Meir and the Chachamim is if it's something that could be brought together with its matir or could be brought later. The Rabbanan held that's not called davar hanitar, and therefore there's no pigul on it. But Reb Meir held depends if it's brought together with the carbon, space carbon, such as the lik shemen is brought with the asham etzoyra, or the nesachim are brought together with the carbon that it's associated with, then you will say it could become also machmas pigul. Zok the head of the one. Omar Ula, a little bit of a cryptic saying. Koimetz pigul, a koimetz of pigul, shehelu al gabei hamizbech, that you put onto the mizbech, paka piguloi mimenu, its pigul dissipates, goes away. How do I know this? Imacher maybe de pigul who atzmoy la kol shagain. So let's see what this means. Amar Ula koimetz piguloi, koimetz pigul shehelu al gabei mizbech. There was a kmitza of pigul. How did it become pigul? Because when you made the kmitza, the kohen had a machshava pigul. Then he put the koimetz, which is the davar hamatir. He put it on the mizbech. Paka pigula mimenu. So right away, it's a very interesting thing because it's the davar hamatir, not the davar haniter. The davar hamatir never becomes pigul. So what does it mean? What does it mean that the koimetz pigul shelo al gav mizbech paka pigula mimenu? And the svara for Rava to say that is it climbing up me? The svara for Rava to say that is im acher maybe de pigul. What's that? If the koimetz can bring other things to become pigul, meaning the koimetz will make the shirayim pigul, who atzmoy loy kol shagain, surely in itself has to be kosher. This is a little bit of a cryptic message. What are we trying to say over here? Zok the Gemara, this is what it's saying. If you're not going to say that the koimetz, even after you had the machshav of pigul, is not niskabel on the mizbech as a proper hechsher, well then heich maybe achemul de pigul. Then it won't be able to make pigul. Why won't it be able to make pigul? Because we learned that unless all of the processes of the carbon go through properly, the machshav of pigul won't be chal. So you have to say that the koimetz was a good koimetz, and it's paka the psul of pigul mimenu, so that it's matir the rest of the carbon, and only then will the rest of the carbon, will the shirayim become osur to eat with a chi of karis machmas pigul. Let's see what Rashi says. Maika Omar, The boiler memar paka pigule mimenu. He says the pickle goes away. The nosiv taima the boiler de pickle, which means it was pickle. It was pickle. It's not pickle. What's going on up here? So Ula said, "Me'ena miskabel b'aktora." If it's not a miskabel properly as a kosher aktora, heich maybe achemel de pickle hamakter koimetz al menashi yoichel shiraim l'mochar. If someone was makter koimetz with a machshava pickle that the shiraim will be eaten chutz lizmanoi, heich mincha mispagelas. How will a mincha ever become pickle im ein haktora soy if his aktora is not a valid aktora? Now the Tziyonim add a lot to this Rashi, so let's have a look. If the Haktorah of this Kaimis is not a good Haktorah because it was a Mechsheves Pigel, so then how could it be Mati, the rest of the carbon, Lagabi making it into Pigel? Because we learned a rule. Carbon, Karvu Matira. We know that in order for something to become Pigel, the rest of its avoiders have to be done perfectly. Elavadai Karvu Matira of Karinabe. Even though you had a machshavas pigel while you did the kmitza and put it on the mizbeach, nevertheless it's still considered karvu matira. Why? The paka pigula mimenu. The pagama pigel must leave it in order so that it could now make the rest of the carbon, the shiraim, into pigel. Ulechein kava hashiraim bepigel. That's why the shiraim becomes pigel. V'hachi ka'amar, and this is what Ula said. Surely it itself becomes kosher. If this kmitza was able to make the shiraim into pigel, it must have been niskabel. What does that mean? It was niskabel. My kamashulam. What chiddush is the Ula trying to express? Id ein chayovin olav mishum pigel. If Ula is trying to tell you a halacha that if you eat the kmitza itself, you're not chayiv kares tanina. That's our Mishnah. Elu devarim she'ein chayovin alei mishum pigel, and one of them is a kaimetz. V'aktoris v'alavayna u'minchas kayanim u'minchas kay Mashiach u'minchas nesachim v'adam. So we know that if you eat the davar hamatir itself, there is not going to be a chiyuv kares. So what is Ula telling us? That paka pigula mimenu legabi what halacha v'asamir negeya that it was paka pigula mimenu. It can't be to tell you that if you ate it you're not chayiv kares, because that's what our Mishnah tells us. Elo, you know what Ula was driving at? You know what chiddush she wanted to open on our eyes to? The im olu layerdu. Once the pigel was placed on the mizbeach, even though it's a carbon that's puzzle, it's a carbon of pigel, don't take it off the mizbeach. Frank the Gemara, that's also not a chiddush. Tanina, we learned that as well. We learned how long. What if you have basar that stayed overnight, or you had the kmitza that stayed overnight? So now it's puzzle, or v'hayoytze, or it was puzzle because it left the confines of the azara, or v'atame, or v'shenishchat with a machshava of chutz man or chutz claim, meaning a carbon that was shechted with a machshava is pigel, so the carbon is now pigel. You're not supposed to put its meat onto the mizbeach. But im olu, if mistakenly its meat was placed on the mizbeach, lo yerdu. So that can't be the chiddush of Ula, that the kmitza that was placed onto the mizbeach, which shouldn't have been because it's pigel, that you leave it there, because we have a separate Mishnah to tell us that as well. So once again, what great chiddush is Ula trying to teach us when he said that poka pigula mimenu from the kmitza? The Elo, you know what he might be saying? The yardu yal, maybe he's telling you a huge chiddush. What if it fell off the mizbeach? You have to go and put it back on. That's a huge chiddush, because normally we know if a piece of meat that was puzzle, that was put on the mizbeach by mistake, if it fell off, you don't put it back on. Ula is saying this kmitza you'll put back on. Frank Gemara, Hanami Tanina Deloy. We actually have a brayso that tells us that that's not true. So surely Ula didn't say that you put it back on, because you don't. Where does the brayso say you don't? Because the brayso says as follows: Kishem Shem Alu Lo Yerdu Kachim yerdu lo yalu. So we're back to the drawing board. What great chiddush is Ula trying to teach us by telling us that the Shem Pigel was released from the Kmitza? You didn't just put the Kmitza on the Mizbeach. If you just put the Kmitza on the Mizbeach and it fell off, you don't put it back on. But what if it got singed already? What if it got partially baked? Then it fell off the Mizbeach. Then Zakdula, you put it back onto the Mizbeach. Because the Mizbeach was koinit. Frank the Gemara, Ha-nami amar ula chadazimna. This chiddush, that once something becomes singed, now it has to stay on the Mizbeach. And even if it falls off, you put it back onto the Mizbeach. That's also something that Ula had already taught us elsewhere. There's no reason for him to teach us this halacha by the case of the Kmitza. The Omar Ula, Lo shanu ela shaloi mashla ben nahar. When do we say that a davar that's possible that fell off the Mizbeach? You don't put it back on the Mizbeach. That if it's shaloi mashla ben nahar, it didn't get singed yet. It's not yet partially consumed by the fire. Aval mashla ben nahar. But if there's already some burning, some of this meat is cooked already, then yalu, then you put it back on. So the question is, why did Ula need to tell us this halacha specifically by Kmitza? He already taught us this halacha that once it's already moshlo ben ar, goes back on. Now, what is the reason for moshlo ben ar that it goes back on? Zokt Rashi. Zokt Rashi loy tricha hada Ula el shemoshlo boya. What is that? Why does that make it any different? The moment something is placed onto the Mizbeach and it's partially consumed by the Mizbeach, we say that it's now the lechem of the Mizbeach. We say that it belongs to the Mizbeach. So therefore, if it falls off, afilu yerdu yalu, even if it fell off the Mizbeach, you need to put it back on. But the brisa that we quoted, that says if possible Imur fell off the Mizbeach, don't put him back on. That's b'shaloi mashla bayar. Frank the Gemara, Ula told us that halach as well. Zok Gemara, he needs both halachas. Ma'u the tema. If he would have only told us the halacha by the Ivarim, I would have thought Hanimi li'ever. This halacha, that if it got a little singed and it fell off the Mizbeach, you put it back on, that only applies to an Aver. It's one piece. The Mechaber, it's one big piece. It's one piece that's partially singed. It belongs to the Mizbeach. Avol kaimitz the mifras. What is kaimitz? Kaimitz is some dough that comes apart. So maybe just the singed part, just the crust, will remain on the Mizbeach, or you put back onto the Mizbeach. But maybe the part that wasn't baked at all, you shouldn't put back onto the Mizbeach. Avol kaimitz the mifras. Ey maloi kamash malon, that once even part of the kaimitz got singed, the whole kaimitz goes back on to the Mizbeach. Barry Reichman once told me that in the olden days, the way parlor meetings were invented was they needed to raise money for a mochid. They didn't want to make a whole big event. So a gvir would call over a couple of very wealthy friends, and they would have this guest there who was raising money to say a couple of words, and then everyone gave a little bit of money. Eventually, a parlor meeting grew to everyone in the city being invited. But it was just a small group of friends. So he once was at a parlor meeting, and the speaker at the parlor meeting was Rav Irving Bunim Zechatzadik Levracha. He used to be the president of the Young Israel, but he was a Talmud Muvik of Reb Aaron Kotler. He was by Reb Aaron Kotler's side through thick and through thin. So there's a very good book about him. I'm sorry? I think so. So he was once by this parlor meeting, and he said, I was told that the upper crust of the city will be by this meeting. What is crust? Let me tell you what crust is. Crust is a poor billige brekelach, a few cheap crumbs that are held together by a lot of dough. Zok the Gemara weiter. Rav Achoy. Zok Rav Achoy. Hilchach. Therefore, kai koimitz pigel. What if I had a koimitz of pigel? The palge moches ha'ara, Half of it fell off the Mizbeach on the ground. Upalge aske amarocha, and the half went on to the Mizbeach. So that means part of it was not singed at all. And the part that was on the Mizbeach was singed. Umoshlo or in the half that was singed, masikna le'lekulei lechatchila. You then go and bring the part that was never put on the Mizbeach at all, and you put it on. Because Ula teaches us that we treat the entire smicha like one aver. If part of it, we say, became lachmoi shel Mizbeach because it was somewhat singed, hu adin, the other part is placed on the Mizbeach as well. Let's see Rashi. Kamash Malon, Hilchach, the Kulach Chadevidam Hilchach, even the Machash was Leim Chuber. Since you consider all of the Kemitah as one piece, Afilu loy helayu elachetzoy, even if you only placed half of it on the Mizbeach, Umashlo boy haor, Niklat af zesh ala karka. We say that the part that was never placed on the Mizbeach is also now grabbed by the Mizbeach, the Yala, now you would place it on the Mizbeach. The haki aske luchule nami loy hoyo loy lahaloiso im yere. Because even if you put the whole kmitza onto the Mizbeach and then it fell off, you shouldn't put the whole part back on. You should only put the baked parts. Rather, elamishum mahu shemosh lo ba'or. V'ka'amrit, yet what do we say? The im yere ashar yala. Everything goes back up, even though it didn't get burnt. Why? Because you look at the whole kmitz as one unit. Even though you could break them apart. We say that it's all one piece. It goes on to the Mizbeach. Hapigol v'anoisar v'atamoy shehelan alagabe Mizbeach poka iser mehen. The iser goes away from them. What does that mean? So Rashi poka iser mehen iser pigol lichida amoran, like we just said. Lagabe what halacha shem yered yala. Lagabe that if they fall off the Mizbeach, you put them back on. The iser noiser v'tami nami lahachi shelo yischayev v'oich, so there won't be a chiyuv. Now the Bach has a very important point over here. So let's have a close look at the Bach. What does the Gemara say here? What is Rashi saying over here? Legabi what halacha do we say that the pigel goes away? Lichida amaran shem yered yala. So not that the pigel goes off and you're allowed to eat them. You're not allowed to eat them. The whole halacha is if they fall off the mizbech, you put them back on. Zokt the Bach. Haki sun shem yered yala near a beer pirish. I think that's what the nun base means. Aval inyin zeh loy paka isurei. But lagabe achila avada the issue didn't go off. If you eat the meat that's tummy that's on the mizbeach that was pigel as well, there'll be a chiv kares. Shim ochloi la'acher shehelu. What if these amorim were placed onto the mizbeach and then someone ate them? Someone took them off the mizbeach and ate them. Chayiv, he will be chayiv. Lagabe the iser of pigel, we don't say that the iser went off. We only say paka pigule lagabe, placing it back onto the mizbech. Zok Bach a go'onish raya. For Raya, we have a pasha to raya because the Mishnah says midapirish b'masnisin. In our Mishnah, what does it say? The choshev dam the koimates. Dam and the koimates are both listed as items in our Mishnah where there's no din pigel on them. She'ein bahem mishum pigel. By dam and koimates, there's no din pigel. Why? Mishum the igufei matir. Because the dam and the koimates themselves are matirin, and therefore they don't have a din of pigel. Now the question is, based on what Rish Lakish is saying, why do we need a svara? Because they're a matir. Typically, the loy shaykh pay pigel. Why don't you say it would be impossible for them to have an isur pigel? Why? The iachlan kodim shehelu. If you ate the dam or the koimates before it was placed onto the mizbeach, that disqualifies the whole pigel because arei loy karva matikim mitzvase. V'ila acher shehelu, and if you were the Mishnah talking about eating these items, this dam and this koimitz, after they were placed on the mizbeach, well, Ula said harei paka yisur man. So Lagabi, what is our Mishnah telling us that there's no din pigel? Anyway, there's no din pigel. There's no special halacha since a davar matter. There's no pigel. It's on the mizbeach. There's no din pigel. Ela vada, it must be the laha paka yisur man. When Ula said it's paka yisur man, he didn't mean that you're allowed to eat it. He just meant shem yerdu yalu. Our Mishnah says that if you're talking about the davar matter itself, that you could even eat. But Ula's halacha is only that in yerdu yalu, but not that you're allowed to eat it. That's a Rashi only learned that paka yisur man means lagabe the din that it becomes pigel, and the lagabe din that it becomes pigel, but avada it means lagabe din that becomes pigel that im yerdu yalu and not lagabe eating it, because in fact you cannot say that it would be mutter to eat, because then our Mishnah would be shver. Beautiful. Zok the heilige Gemara weiter. Amar Rab Chisda, Maridichi, master of the sugya. Rashi Bala Shmur Zois, master of the sugya. What are you telling me? That when you put something that's pigel, something that's noisy, something that tummy, just place it on the mizbeach, poof, it becomes automatically mutter. Mizbeach mikveh tahira. What is the mizbeach? Some type of magical device that you put Isra on it, and poof, it suddenly becomes mutter. Omer Abzera, no, we're not speaking about the fact that it was placed on the mizbeach. Rather, it was shemosh leba'anaor. The mizbeach was already koiled. So you're right. The mizbeach is not a mikveh tahira. Just placing something on the mizbeach has no impact. The impact is from the fact that it got partially burnt, and now the mizbeach was koiled. Omer Abzera, shemosh lebanar. Masav Rabbi Yitzchak bar Bisna. Achayim say the following Allah. V'tomasay Allah. So this is talking about eating basar when one eating basar kachim where one is tummy. And the pasuk says in Vayikra Vav, "Basar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yeyachel." If the basar itself is tamei, one may not eat it. Be'eshi sarei. Doesn't say any chiyuv kares. There's an issue to eat it with a lav. The basar called tar yoichel basar, and tar basar shall be eaten only by someone who is tar. Now we talk about someone who ate meat that was tar, but he was tamei. V'nefesh asher toicha basar mizevach hashlamim asher lashem v'tamasei alav, and he is tamei. V'nichris hanefesh ahi me'ameha, he will get kares. So zokt the acher v'tumasei alav. Mi shetuma perachas mimenu yotza basar sheintuma perachas mimenu. Let's pause here a second. Let's read this pasuk again. What is this pasuk really talking about? I typed it obviously that it means the person was tamei, the basar was tahor. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe va'nevesh asher teichel basar mizevach hashlamim asher Hashem v'tumasei alav, and there's tum on the basar. V'nichris hanefesh me'amel. So how do you know that this pasuk is talking about when the person is tamei and the basar is tar? Maybe this pasuk is speaking about when the person is tar and the basar is tamei. Zog dachem v'tumasei alav mi shetuma parachas mimenu. We're talking about a tuma that it's only also when it's alav, but this tuma could leave. Yotza basar she'ein tuma parachas mimenu. Once a Michael, once basar becomes tamei, there is no way to ever be matarid. You can't put him to a mikveh. On the other end, a person could be metar himself if he's tamei. He can go to the mikveh. He can get zrikas gimel v'sheva, arba v'sheva. So at the end of the day, and there's a tumah on him that could be released, meaning it must be a human to become tamei. Therefore, that's what the pasuk was referring to. The im Isa, but the way you're learning, Rab Achoy is learning that I call it pigel once it goes on to the Mizbeach, it becomes Hutar. And you said even Tomei Shehel on Lagabe Mizbeach, Poka Isser Mayem. So I bezoi, Hare Tuma Perachas Mimenu, all Yudea are. You, Rabbi Choy, are saying that if you put meat on the Mizbeach that was Tomei, the Tumah goes away. And therefore, even if it fell off the Mizbeach, you put it back on. So Tumah also is something that could come and go. And if that's the case, back to square one, how do you know this pasuk was speaking about when the person that ate the basar shlomim was tamei? Maybe he's tar, and we're talking about the basar shlomim that was tamei. Amarava al yidei mikveh kamrinahom. The Tamas Elav means tumah that can dissipate by going into a mikveh. Frank, that doesn't say in the pasuk anymore. It just says in the pasuk that tumah dissipates. Midi mikveh ksiv doesn't say anything about a mikveh by the Tamas Elav. So based on Rabbi Choy's halacha, that you take pasuk of tumah and you put it on the mizbeach, the tumah goes away. How do you know that this pasuk is speaking about the chiyuv kares for someone who's tumah who ate kachim that was tar? Maybe the chiyuv kares is for someone tar who eats kachim that is tumah. Elamar papa bibisar shlomim askinon lechazi lakrava. The whole shaila over here is not relevant. Put on the mizbeach because we're talking about the shlomim. This pasuk is referring to the shlomim. That pasuk doesn't go on the mizbeach. So therefore, the particular pasuk that's being discussed here will not have to hire b'mizbeach, and therefore this has to be referring to the Tamas Elav, has to be referring to the person. Gewaltig. Ravina Amar, Ravina says a different shot. V'Tamas Elav mishetuma perachas mimenu kishahu sholem. The Tamas Elav means the tumah's on him, the tumah can leave him, and he will remain intact. But the basar that you put on the mizbeach, yes, as Rabbi Choy said, the tumah dissipates. But the tumah only dissipates once the meat is partially consumed by the fire. Yotza basar davar shein tumah perachas kishu sholem ela kishu chaser, as it starts to become diminished and eaten by the flame, and therefore this has to be referring. The Tamas Elav has to be referring to a human. Gufa, so now we're going to go off on a tangent. And now we're going to be talking about the halacha that we're learning in this pasuk, that one who is tamei, who eats basar kachim, basar mizevach hashlamim, will be chayiv kares. Gufa, v'Tamas Elav, v'tumas haguf hakosaf medaber. The pasuk is speaking about a person who's tamei eating meat that's tahar. Ata oimer v'tumas haguf, maybe the Tamas Elav is referring to the Tamas Basar. Zok Gemara, Nemer Kan Tamasai. It says Tamasai in this pasuk in reference to eating meat of a carbon shlomim. V'Nemer La'alon Tamasai Elav. It says later on Tamasai Elav. Let's read the pasuk. Kol Hanogeya B'Meis B'Nefesh Adam Hashayamus. Clearly, a person who's tamei. And he will not be matar himself. Es mishkan Hashem timei v'nichris al nefashim Yisrael kimei nida loy zarek olav. He didn't get a tahira. Tamei yiyah, he remains tamei oy tumasoi vay. So it says tumasoi. So just like this pasuk, malalon b'tumas aguf hakosav v'daber. Clearly, this pasuk is speaking about tumas aguf. It says kol anageh b'meis b'nefesh adam. Asher Yamos. So we're clearly speaking in this pasuk about somebody who is tamei. Afghan, so too the Tamasai of the earlier psukim are also going to be speaking about the tumas aguf hakos of medaber. So we need to stop for a second, because if you think about it, the pasuk of Vayikra is saying if you are tamei and you eat mi b'sar zevach hashlomim, you're chayiv kares. What is this pasuk saying? Again, the pasuk is saying. Here talking about again, it's Mishkan Hashem Timei v'nichus al nefashim Yisrael. Okay, no, this is talking about. I'm sorry, this seems to be talking about going into the Beis Hamikdash, not necessary eating. We're going to have another pasuk that talks about eating. Okay, Zok Gemara Vayter. Rabbi Yosy is another way to solve the problem. How do you know that the Tamas Elav is referring to the person being tamei and not the basar being tamei? So Zok Rabbi Yosy, Hoyel v'nemru kacham b'loshen rabim v'nemru tuma. Let's look at it. It says the nefesh is singular. Asher toichal basar mizevach hashlamim. Shlomim is plural, multiple karbonis. Asher Lashem v'tumasay love back to singular tense. So clearly, when the Torah is talking about the meat, it uses a plural tense. When the Torah is talking about the person, it uses a singular tense. So that's how I know that v'tumasay love is talking about the person. Rabbi Omer, Rabbi said, I have another raya that v'tumasay love is referring to the person, not the meat, because it says v'ochal. It says v'nefesh asher toichel basim zevach shlomim. So it says another pasuk v'nefesh kisiga bechol tamei v'tumas adam oy bebehema oy behema tameya oy bechol sheket tamei v'ochal mi besar zevach shlomim. Clearly, we're talking about the person who's tamei, who ate mi besar zevach shlomim. And what does it say there? V'nichrisa nefesh imemel. So Rabbi Omer v'ochal v'tumas aguf medaber. Since this pasuk is speaking v'tumas aguf, we will say that pasuk is also speaking v'tumas aguf. The question that you have to ask is, why do I need two psukim to tell me that there's a chi of chorus if somebody is tamei, eats kachim? One pasuk is enough. That's something that the Gemara will discuss further. The Gemara is going to actually say there's even a third pasuk that says that someone who's tamei who eats kachim will become chai of chorus. But that we'll leave. But the main thing is we have proof that the tamei who eats from B'sar Zevach HaShlomim, he's the one who's chayiv kos. Gewaltig. Achayim Amru, which is the Achayim that was the cause for us even bringing this whole brisa into our sugya. From V'tamasei Alav, Misha Tuma Parachas Mimenu, Yotza Basar Shein Tuma Parachas Mimenu. Gewaltig. Amar Mar. Rabbi, and we learned Tuma Parachas Mimenu unless it's diminished. Amar Mar. Now let's go delve into the Rebbe. Rebbe Yomer v'ochal v'tumas haguf hakasav medaber. My mashma. How do you see that from this pasuk? Omar Rabba tells an interesting thing. Kol kra d'loy mefarish le Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdumi. Any pasuk that Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdumi hasn't explained to us how to teach the pasuk, and v'chol masnisa and any brisa d'loy mifresh le zeiri that zeiri didn't explain to us. Loy mifresha. In other words, there's no pshat that could compare to the pshat in the pasuk offered up by Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avudimi, and there's no pshat in the brisa that could compare, that could measure up to the pshat that Zeiri will tell us in the brisa. And now we're going to see how Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avudimi darshan these psukim, so that we know that the tumah that's mechayiv someone chorus is tumah saguf, eating basar that's tumah. Hachi Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avudimi. Very fascinating diuk in the pasuk. As I learned in the pasuk, it says as follows: "Whenever asher toichel, toichel is a lashon nekeva. We're talking female here. Pasuk hakasav b'lashon nekeva, v'sayim b'lashon nekeva. It says v'nichrisa hanefesh imemel. It's female tense, but v'lashon zachar be'emsa v'tum asay olav. That's lashon zachar. Almost like we're talking about somebody else. So therefore, the Lashon Zachar be'emtza, that tells us the tumas haguf hakasav medaber. That tells us that it's b'tumas haguf. How do you see that that's b'tumas haguf? Zokt Rashi, hoyel upasach hakasav hasheni v'lashon nekeva v'sayim v'lashon nekeva v'lashon Zachar be'emtza. So right off the bat, you see I touched the Gemara wrong, because Rashi's Kosav Hasheni. I was looking at the Kosav Harishon. So the Kosav Hasheni is here. The Nefesh Kisiga, that's Lashon Nekeva. B'chol Tomei, B'tumas Adam, Oy B'behema Tmeya, Oy B'chol Sheket Tomei. V'ochal is Lashon Zachar. V'ochal Mibsar Zevach HaShlomim Asher Lashem, and then V'nichrisa is once again Lashon Nekeva. So the second pasuk goes from Nekeva to Zachar back to Nekeva. So let's see what it says. Nevesh kisiga b'chol tamei v'ochal mib'sar zevach hashlamim v'nichrisa v'loiksiv v'ochla mib'sar zevach. If we're talking about Lashon Nekeva before, so the Lashon should have been v'ochla, and she ate from b'sar zevach. But it says v'ochal. Have af harishon al tamalov in pasach v'sayim b'Lashon Nekeva v'Lashon Zachar b'emtza af al pi kain v'tumas haguf hakasav medaber. So that's what Rashi is saying. In the first pasuk that we're struggling to know what v'tumasei love means. Is it going on the behema? Is it going on the person? We don't know. But look at the second pasuk. Now you might want to argue it's got to be going on the behema. Why? Because if it's going on the adam, it should have stuck to the female tense. The fact that when it was talking about the person, it used female tense, and then it said v'tumasei love, which would indicate now we're talking about something else. We're talking about the meat. Zokt, if you talk about v'dume, it's not true. Because if you look at the next pasuk, where it's clear that it's all referring to the person, nevertheless, it also switches back and forth from Lashon Nekeva to Lashon Zachar, and that doesn't mean necessarily that we're now talking about the meat. Therefore, you could say if it's good for the second pasuk, it's good for the first pasuk. And that's all Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avadumi is saying, is that since you see in the second pasuk, even though it's speaking about the person the whole time, it switches back and forth from Lashon Zachar to Lashon Nekeva. You could learn the same thing in our pasuk. Now that we piqued our interest, you told us that no one could fatayich a brisa like Zeiri. Tell me, what is this brisa that Zeiri fatayich? Masnisa the Tanya. It says Azor, a very cryptic brisa. Im namru kalois. If it lists off the kalois in reference to Tumah, it's some type of Tumah discussion. Lama namru chamurais. Why did it itemize the more severe? Vim namru chamurais. And if the Torah lists off the more severe, lama namru kalois. Why did the Torah list off the kalois? Im namru kalois v'loy chamurais. If it only lists off the kalois and not the chamurais, hayisi omer, I would have thought ala kalois balav. The kalois are with alav, which we're going to soon see means if someone ate meiser with a tumas sheretz, so a tumah hakal, and in a kochim hakal meiser is like a lightweight kochim, there's a lav. But if you ate truma with tumas agof, b'misa you'll be chayav misa. Lakach noimru chamurais. That's why it said chamurais to tell you that there's no misa by chamurais, which is not halachically true. If you eat truma when you're tamei b'tumas sheretz, you'll be chayav misa. V'imnamru chamurais v'lemru kalois. If it only has said chamurais and not kalois, hayisiyomer ala chamurais shechayiv. You're chayav ala for chamurais. So this is a very cryptic brisa. This is where we need Ziri to help us. So Zok Gemara, my kalois umay chamurais. When the brisa is talking about kalois and chamurais, what exactly is it referring to? Ilema kalois meiser. Does kalois mean meiser? And the chamurais means truma. So what does the first lashon of the brisa say? In Nemru Kalois, Lama Nemru Chamuris, Nemru Chudam Nemru Kalois. Now, in Nemru Kalois, if it would have only, the Pasuk only told us that if one eats Meiser, when he's Tama eats Osir, Veloy Chamurais, and didn't tell us that by when one eats Truma, V'tumasa, he's Chayiv Misa B'Deshemayim, you know what I would have said? Hayisi Yomer, Ala Kalois B'Lav, V'Ala Chamuris B'Misa. Now that has two problems. First of all, why would you say the balt the kalosh and balav the chamur shabramisa? We have a rule of daya lovim in adin liyosh kanidain. Even if you want to learn chamurish from kalosh, you can make them more stringent than the kalosh. So if anything, they would have the same issue as the kalosh. Problem number one. Problem number two is the brisa says if we didn't say chamurish, we would think chamurish shabramisa. What's wrong with that? The chamurish are b'misa. That is the halacha. So that would be perfect. So that's what the Gemara asks on this brisa for a while. So for the Gemara. My kalach my chamuris. Ilim bekalis ma'aser and chamuris or truma. So hayisi omer b'misa. Hashtanami ha b'misa. That's good. That's what we pass. Visu. What do you mean v'mloy nemru? If it didn't say chamuris, hayisi omer b'misa. How could I learn that since kalish is allowed, chamuris will be b'misa? You never say that. Daya lovim in the din liyosh kenidain. You can't learn a greater chumrah from ma'aser and apply that to Truma. If a Meiser it's only in Isser and there's no Chiv Misa, why in the world would I think that there would be a Chiv Misa by Truma? Ella, what we're forced to learn is, Kalois means Tuma Sheretz. We're not talking about what the Avera was. Is the Avera Chamura like Truma? Or is the Avera Akala like Meiser? No. Is the Tuma Akala? Or is the Tuma Chamura? So Tuma's Kalois are Tuma Sheretz. Why? Because that just needs to go to the mikvah. Chamura is the Tumah Chamura is if it's Tumas Meis, if your tummy makwas Tumas Meis, you need Zrika. Uvamai. So let's see, what exactly are we talking about? Iba Truma, If we're talking about truma, you have the same problem. EDB ubabisa. Sai the kalis and sai the chamur shavar misa. It doesn't make a difference if a kohen is tamei b'tumas sheretz or if a kohen is tamei b'tumas mace. Either way, if he eats truma, will be chayv misa. V'su lakach nemru chamurais the balav habamisi. What do you mean lakach nemru chamurais that it's going to be a lav? It's not a lav. It's misa. That's what we're saying. If someone eats truma when he's tummy, there's a chayv misa. The iba achilas meiser, and if you want to say that the Brisa is only talking about achilas meiser, and we're making a distinction between tumas sheretz and tumas mates, that doesn't make sense either. Eloi nemru chamuris hayisi aimer ala chamuris b'misa. What are you talking about? Hami tumas sheretz ka'asya v'daya lovim and idli yeshkanidan. We're learning that if someone is tamei tumas mates and he eats meiser, we want to say he'll be chayiv misa. How could you say that? You learn it from tumas sheretz, and by tumas sheretz, someone eats meiser, he's not chayiv misa. So we have a massive problem with pshat in this brisa, and that's what Zeiri came to help us with. And the Mitzvah will learn Zeiri's pshat tomorrow.